Welcome to the Bilingual Montessori webinar series. Hello, I'm Amy with Bilingual Montessori. We are here to support you in building stronger bilingual programs. This series has been made possible through Erasmus Plus funding by the European Union. Thanks for your interest in this webinar about language planning for families. We have Dr. Eowyn Crisfield joining us today from England, where she lives as the mother of three variously multilingual children, whilst running her company, Cristfield Educational Consulting. Her children have influenced her understanding and approaches to raising bilingual children in various ways, as each one is unique. Besides the important job of motherhood, Eowyn is a specialist in language acquisition and development, a writer, a researcher, and a senior lecturer of English language and TESOL at Oxford Brookes University. She has a background in supporting bilingual families, teaching, and teacher training. She works with families, schools, and governmental organizations to develop ethical and holistic approaches to the challenge of supporting multilingual children. Through her company, she does training for parents and teachers on bilingualism and bilingual education. She developed a Parents as Language Partners program and consults with families and schools. Her recent book, Bilingual Families, A Practical Language Planning Guide, combines academic research with practical advice to support successful bilingual and multilingual development. You can find more about Eowyn on her websites, on raisingbilingualchildren.com for parents and cristfieldeducationalconsulting.com for schools. Thank you, Eowyn, for joining us. Now I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be doing this webinar for the Montessori group, and I hope that wherever you're joining from, you find it both interesting and useful in some ways. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the language we use to talk about languages so that we have a common understanding of our terms. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the research on raising bilingual children, what we know. And then we'll finish with some practical strategies for different kinds of families. So I'm hoping to lead you through a journey from the research through to the practice aspects of raising bilingual children. The first big question we need to ask ourselves is, who is bilingual and what does it mean to be bilingual? When we look at this term, we often have very, very different assumptions about what bilingualism is. And so the first thing that I will indicate to you is that I use the terms bilingual and multilingual interchangeably. Bilingual and multilingual in research context now both mean 2 languages or more. So whether your child has 2 languages or more, you can use either of those terms for them. The second big question that we're going to think about is, how do we define bilingualism? How do we know if we're bilingual? How do we know if our children are bilingual? What are the measures we can use? And so when we look at how we define bilingualism in common media, we see all kinds of definitions or headlines that lead us to believe that bilingualism is a very, very high bar to set. These are some of the things that come up quite frequently when I do work with families, when we talk about how do we define bilingualism. And all of these are ideas that are linked to this idea of being equally good in 2 languages, that to say I'm bilingual, I need to be equally comfortable and competent in both of those languages or all of those languages. I need to sound like a native speaker. I can't have an accent or I can't call myself bilingual. And that we need to have this high level of ability to, dream in both languages, to work in both languages. And there's very often a kind of a sense of perfection. In order to claim bilingualism, we have to be a perfect speaker of a language. And commonly that's associated with the secondary idea that only bilingualism can be claimed if we've had 2 languages from a very young age or from birth. So we're going to look at these ideas through another lens now. I'm going to share with you a definition of bilingualism that comes from the kinds of children that I've worked with over the last decades, but that's really representative of how we as human beings learn additional languages. So here is the definition we're going to be working from today. Bilingualism is the ability to understand and use two or more languages in certain contexts and for certain purposes. So I'd like you to think about that definition for just a little minute and reflect on how different it is or how similar it is from how you would have personally defined bilingualism before starting this seminar today. And some of the things I'd like you to think about is what is absent in this definition, not necessarily so much what is present, but what is absent. Because compared to the previous slide, you can see that what is absent is any indication of perfection or equal ability or fluency or accent. It doesn't say anything at all like about sounding like a native speaker. And so we really need to think carefully about this definition because it represents how children learn languages in the world that they live in and in all of the things that are happening around them. They learn language in a context in which they hear it and a purpose for which they need it. And that means that bilingualism is essentially modular for children. Every child will learn to do different things in different languages depending on who's around them and what languages they're speaking. So if, for example, you come from a family where the father does all the cooking and he always does the cooking in German and the mother never does any cooking and she speaks Italian, the child may have a far more developed vocabulary around food and cooking in German because that's the context of cooking for them through the German language and the purpose of talking to their father about food and cooking. And so there is no one size fits all measure for bilingualism. We learn to do the things we need to do in the context that we're exposed to. And so when we look at bilingualism through this lens, it changes a lot the ways in which we consider who is and who isn't bilingual. And that's really important because we need to recognize that bilingualism isn't a quest to be 3 language speakers in one brain. In fact, becoming bilingual changes the language framework within your brain to accept different languages in a connected way. And so our languages are always interconnected. We always use them together. And then we also can use them in isolation. And so this definition is really very, very important to remember when we're raising young bilinguals, that they will only have language from the context in which they're exposed to that language and the purposes for which they need it. In addition, we need to take into account that for young children in particular, there are different types of bilingualism. The first type of bilingualism is what we call simultaneous bilingualism. These are children who have two languages or more from birth. And so they're learning those languages at the same time. And we call that simultaneous bilingualism. Many of us, including myself, are actually sequential bilinguals. We learned one language at home with our families and we added other languages later. So I was raised as a native English speaker. I had only English until I was an adult and then I learned French. And now I consider myself French proficient and I would absolutely consider myself bilingual. There's a lot of talk about which one is better. And certainly again, in the common media, you'll see that learning 2 languages from birth is always better than learning 1 language at birth. And to a certain extent, that is true. Children who have the benefit of having 2 languages or more in their home and environment will become bilingual without any additional effort. Learning another language when you're 5 years old at school, or when you're 15 years old at school, or when you're 40 years old as an adult, does require effort and time in a way that it doesn't require it for younger children. That's not to say that outcomes can't be just as good for people who are sequential bilinguals. One of the biggest myths is that adults can't learn language as well, and that's not true at all. Adults often don't have the time to learn language as well. It's not that they can't, it's that they have so many other things to do that they just don't have the time and attention that a very young child does. And so learning other languages is beneficial no matter how old we are, and we needn't be worried about being an older speaker of a language because that's absolutely valuable in other ways as well. I'm going to talk you through several terms that we use to talk about our children's languages, because in complex bilingual situations, it's very important to have a clear set of vocabulary to talk about our children's languages with different people. The first term that we use now very commonly in research is the term home language. These are languages that are spoken in the home from birth. So that's the language of the parents, the caregivers, the grandmother if she lives with you, anybody who is spending a considerable amount of time with a newborn baby and using a language with them consistently in the home. Those languages are potentially home languages. We have for a long time called those languages mother tongue, and indeed in many languages we still do use the term mother tongue, but in fact the term mother tongue is confusing and also a little bit sexist, because of course if the parents speak different languages, they're both important. And so you often sometimes see it also called L1 for language one. I prefer the term home languages because it gives us a clear idea of what's happening around the home of the child. The second term we need to understand and use is the term first languages. There is some overlap between home languages and first languages. In that first languages are a language that a child has heard regularly from birth in or outside the home. So the home language is also a first language. But if, for example, you take my children, they were born into an English and French speaking home in the Netherlands where they went to childcare in Dutch. Dutch was not a home language for them, but it was a first language. And so that's where that overlap happens. The third term is second or additional languages. These are languages that children begin learning after their first language is fairly well developed. We don't have a clear age barrier for stopping using L1 and starting using L2. Research isn't that refined, but we do know that there's a growing impact on the context that the child is learning in. So a child who's learning 30 minutes of English a week at the age of 5 will not necessarily develop that L2 as quickly as a child who's learning 20 hours a week at the age of 5. And so there's an effect on the language development of second languages, the amount of input and the context, and in terms of where they eventually get with those languages. The final term, and indeed most likely the most important for you in your ongoing journey, is the term dominant language. Almost all bilingual children start having a language preference by the time they're, depending on their situation, 4, 5, 6 years old, very often when they start school. So the dominant language is the language a child is strongest in at any point. It's their favorite language. It's the one they'll choose to use if they have a choice. The dominant language is not fixed. It changes over time. And indeed, for adults, our dominant language can change as well. If we move to another country and become very comfortable in another language, we may start to find our own home language is getting a little bit rusty. And we think, oh, I can't remember that word in English anymore. I can't remember that word in Polish. And so dominant language is not fixed. It changes over time. But in particular with children, we need to know which of the languages that they have in their environment is their dominant language at any time. Because if we're concerned about their language development, that's the one we look to see how they're doing. So the dominant language should always be at an age-appropriate level, no matter what that language is. They need one language that's functioning at the right level for their age. And so we're going to come back a little later to having conversations with other people, and we're going to talk about that idea of dominant language again. So when we start to use these terms consistently within our families, we start to get a better picture of our children's language profiles in their development and in how they're doing in their different languages. Another question, well, not even a question, another thing that I get told very often, everywhere I go in the world, people are very happy to tell me that children are language sponges and all children can soak up languages without any additional effort. So I thought we'd spend just a little bit of time thinking about the research on this and understanding to what point it's true or not true. So if we put the child at the center and we think about how children develop additional languages, we know that age impacts how well children develop in a language. We know that it's not necessarily always younger is better, but younger gives you more time, and younger is better for example, developing a native speaker accent. We know that the distance between the language a child is trying to learn and the languages they already speak will have an impact on their development as well. So if I'm an English-speaking child trying to learn Japanese, that will take me more time and effort than if I'm an English child trying to learn Dutch, simply because the distance between those two languages in terms of how they function, how they sound, how they're written, but also how they make meaning. The more significant those differences are, the longer it takes statistically to acquire the new language. Language aptitude is also a really important factor for adults and for children alike. Some people simply have a talent for languages, and some people don't have that kind of innate, I'm quite good at languages and I enjoy that. And that's true for a 3-year-old, true for a 30-year-old, true for a 60-year-old. It's not a changeable attribute. You have the language aptitude you have. But one of the good things about that is that really important is alongside aptitude is motivation. We definitely know I know from years of being a language teacher, but also from, understanding the research, we do see that people who have less strong aptitude can still reach very high levels if they're very motivated. So motivation has an impact as well. This is important to remember for young children, that young children aren't always necessarily motivated to learn new languages. Just because their parents want them to do it doesn't mean that A, they understand that, or B, that they're particularly interested. In my 15 years of living in the Netherlands, I met many, many families who put their children into Dutch childcare thinking, oh, they'll learn Dutch without a problem. And 2 or 3 years later, they walked out without very much Dutch at all because the child just wasn't motivated for it, didn't see the purpose. And so motivation is really powerful as well. Then we have other personality factors that influence how well a child learns a language or an adult. This is things like anxiety, extroversion, introversion, all of those factors that will influence how much a child is willing to take risks, to say something when they're not quite sure about if it's the right way to do it, or how much they're likely to just be quiet when they're not sure about what they're understanding or what they're saying. And again, similar patterns for children and for adults, personality factors have an influence. And finally, if we're putting our children in a school to learn a new language, so for example, into a bilingual school or an immersion school, and that's part of our language plan for them, there is an effect on how well your children like to be in school. So a child who loves being in class and loves doing worksheets and reading and writing will naturally pick up a language more quickly than a child who's far more kinesthetic, would rather be playing football, isn't really interested in reading, or isn't engaged in reading. And so it's not a measure of intelligence at all. It's just a measure of, if a child learns mathematics easily in the classroom and learns to read easily in the classroom, they're likely to learn a new language more easily too, simply because it suits their ways of learning and their kind of particularly things that they enjoy. And so in fact, you can see that children are not sponges. They are complex. And like all of us, some children are going to have strengths in learning languages and some children are not. Some children will be very motivated to learn languages and some will not. And so we cannot ever say that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to teaching children languages, because they're all different, just as we are. Now that I've explained to you the complexities of raising bilingual children a little bit, we need to go back to this question: is it a good idea to raise our children with languages? If we're a monolingual family, should we be trying to have our child learn another language? If we're a bilingual family, should we only choose one? A lot of bilingual families are given advice, choose one. Absolutely. Becoming bilingual from a young age has positive effects on children's linguistic and educational development. It is absolutely a worthwhile journey to take, but we need to recognize it's not necessarily always as easy as it's made out to be. And so when we look at the positive effects, we know there are linguistic benefits to becoming bilingual as a child. We know that when your brain has kind of figured out more than one way of talking, thinking, writing, expressing yourself, at a young age, you're more likely to be able to acquire new languages efficiently when you're older as well. We also know that the more languages you have, the more people you can talk to, the more doors are open for you. And so just linguistically, it's absolutely worth it for children to become bilingual from a young age. There is a lot in the news about the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, that being bilingual makes you smarter, makes you a better decision maker, makes you more creative, makes, all kinds of things you can read about in popular media. The research on cognitive benefits indicates that there seem to be some cognitive benefits, but it's not consistent enough yet, or high quality enough yet, for us to be very sure what those benefits are and for what kind of bilinguals those are. But it would seem to be the case that there are different areas where being bilingual can enhance how your brain functions. But more importantly, we know that becoming bilingual doesn't have a negative effect on your cognition. And that's actually the most important thing. But I think we should never choose to raise our children as bilinguals because we want them to be smarter. We should choose to raise our children as bilinguals because we want them to be able to have a wider world to talk to. That's the linguistic benefits. And we want them to be better and more empathetic communicators. And that's the social benefits. We do know there's a growing body of research that children who have languages from a young age are just good communicators. They're determined communicators. They're willing to persist when conversations aren't easy. They're willing to try to change how they're talking, to be supportive of other people because of this experience they've had from a young age of having to figure out how to talk to different people in different languages. So I think the social benefits actually outweigh any particular idea of cognitive benefits. And this is why we should be focusing on bilingualism. So how do we go about planning for bilingualism if we've decided we want our children to be bilingual for any particular reason? I talk a lot about family language planning, and parents sometimes ask me, why do we need a plan? Why can't we just speak our languages? You can just kind of wing it and give it a try. But the reality is that raising a child as a bilingual within a bilingual community can be quite straightforward. So for example, in India, the vast majority of the population, if not all of the population, speaks a minimum of 2 or 3 languages in different contexts and different purposes. So if you're surrounded by a community that speaks 3 languages, you can be confident your child will learn those 3 languages. But if you are a Japanese German couple living in France with your child in an English school, Japanese, German, English, and French, you have a very small community for some of those languages. The smaller your community of practice, the more you need to think about how are we going to be sure that our children get the languages we want them to have. So learning languages is a long-term commitment. It takes many years and a lot of input to be comfortable in a new language, whether we start at birth or whether we start at 40 years old. And so we need to think about this as a journey that we're on with our children. And with that journey idea, having a clear plan gives us the security in knowing that we're giving them the best support that we possibly can. So we're going to talk a little bit now about the practicalities of family language planning, how we go about it and what it might entail. This is not going to be in detail. I'm going to give you some ideas and you could follow them up later if you want to. So the first thing you need to think about when you're thinking about a family language plan is goal setting. What do we want for our children, for our languages? The second is your strategies for where they're going to hear those languages, who's going to speak those languages, how they're going to develop in them. And the third thing that you need to think about is all the important conversations you need to have along the way in order to make sure everybody is doing their best for your child. So when we think about setting language goals for our children in terms of their language development, there are 3 different goals we can set. The first is what I call a communicative goal. These are languages that we want our children to be orally proficient in, to be able to understand them and speak them. Often these are community languages or dialects. Either they don't have a written form or our children don't need to learn them and learn to read and write them. And also what I would call temporary languages. If you've moved to Korea for 3 years, you want your child to learn some Korean to play with other children, but when you leave, you have no way to keep it up. So temporary languages are languages that you have because of your current living situation, which is temporary. And so for all of these, I would say a communicative goal is where you would situate your efforts. The second kind of goal you can set is a basic literacy goal. These are languages you want your children to be able to read and write to a basic level. You want them to be able to read environmental text, signs in the metro, menus, headlines of newspapers, to be able to make their way around in their world, and to have basic writing ability, to be able to write a note or a memo to somebody, but you're not concerned about their spelling or their grammar because they're not languages that they're going to use for academic purposes. Any language that your child is going to use for education or potentially for work is a language we would set an academic literacy goal for. And that means these are the languages that they need to learn to read and write in fully and fluently and to a high degree of accuracy in order to be able to access, the best of their potential in terms of school and work. And so the more complex your family is, the harder this is to do. If you have 2 languages, you can set academic literacy goals for both and you're fine. If you have 5, you need to think a little bit more carefully about the idea of setting certain goals for certain times, because our goals can change and grow as our children get older and our lives change. So if you move to a new country with a baby and you think, we're going to set a communicative goal because we will be here for 3 years, and then in 3 years, you've just signed a contract for another 5 years, you think, okay, well, now we need basic literacy. And then you decide to live there permanently, then you need to shift that goal to academic literacy. And so your goals can change, but knowing contextually and agreeing as a family what our priorities are helps us in the next part of our plan, which is planning for them to get the input they need. So I'm going to differentiate here just a little bit between simultaneous bilinguals, children who are becoming bilingual in the home, and sequential bilinguals, children who are learning 1 or 2 at home and another one at school in particular. When we make a plan for simultaneous bilingualism, we can often come across these models on the internet, on books about bilingualism that we can use, that they encourage parents to choose a model. So the most common model is 1 parent, 1 language. We call it OPAL. So that's, I'm a French speaker, I speak French to my children. My husband is an English speaker, he speaks English to our children. Exactly like that. We do our own jobs and the children will be bilingual. This is a good strategy to use if the parents are only comfortable in their own language, but it's not a guarantee of success. For example, when I was living in the Netherlands, I met many families with 1 Dutch parent and 1 non-Dutch parent. And so they were using 1 parent, 1 language when the children were young. Say the Dutch father was using Dutch with the child and the Dutch mother, or the French mother was using French with the child. So it all seemed quite easy. Mother uses French, father uses Dutch. But then the child started school in Dutch and went to after school care in Dutch. And all of a sudden, the child is getting a lot more Dutch than French. And so 1 parent, 1 language is not a guarantee of success unless you have balance across those languages. A way to get slightly better balance, if it works for your family, is what we call minority language at home. That means both parents use the minority language in the home, and the majority language is used, at school and in the community. So both parents use French at home. Everybody else in the community and at school uses Dutch. There's a better balance there for the child. Okay, it's not always possible because not always the parents don't share each other's languages. Another strategy that you can use if you're comfortable having a go in your partner's language is what we call domains of use, which is, for example, every night at dinner, we all use this language together. On Saturdays, we all use this language. It's thinking about what languages make sense in different contexts and different purposes, and it allows both parents or caregivers to use each other's languages as they're comfortable as well. So these are in-family strategies for simultaneous bilinguals. And again, on the internet, you'll quite often see this idea that you need to choose one and stick with one. And I'm going to tell you now that actually that's not true. What's really important in raising bilingual children is what we call child-directed speech, or CDS. I, as a parent, talking to my child, that's child-directed speech. And that's the best kind of input for language acquisition. And so your method can be flexible as long as you're sure that your child is getting enough of both or all of their languages to be working towards the goals you set for them. As long as you're paying attention to good quality input and enough input, you can be more flexible about who's using it and when. And so I, as a parent, used French with my children most of the time. I sometimes used English, I sometimes used French, and it didn't break them. But we do always need to keep an eye on our goals and the input patterns. Are they getting enough of each of the languages? And so keeping in mind that children, again, they need to hear a lot of language regularly over a long period of time. If you're not comfortable using your own language with your child when they're 2 years old because you feel it's not your strongest language anymore. You're going to be very uncomfortable using it with them when they're 5. And so sometimes we have to look at our own language preferences as well and make decisions that are right for us, because at the end of the day, we're a parent first and a parent of a bilingual child second. And so these decisions can be quite complex in families. If you are a family who speaks only one language at home, so you're a monolingual family, and you're pursuing bilingualism by having your child go to a school or a childcare or a creche or a Montessori in another language, here's some kind of top tips for you. When should you get started on the second language? Starting at a young age is absolutely fine. So if you want to put your child in other language childcare when they're 2 or 3 years old, it's not a problem at all. But we need to first make sure that at home we're continuing to focus on the development of the home language. So a child's first language from birth, their home language from birth, is a really important part of their cognitive development. And so that language should always be prioritized, and a second language should come along with it. And the better they are on their own language, the more easily they'll learn the second language. So we should never prioritize another language, and normally that's English, over the language that's important to our family. Again, the importance of child-directed speech in learning another language. Technology doesn't work with young children. They may start mimicking Bob the Builder, but they're not really learning language. They learn language from human beings interacting with them. And so you need to think about how you're going to get that input if you don't naturally have it in your home. And if you have a young child who's going to a bilingual creche or a bilingual play school or preschool or a bilingual school, you need to remember to be patient. It's going to take them quite a long time to become comfortable in the new language, and not all children are keen. We'll go back to that idea of motivation. When your child is dropping you in an English language preschool and you live in Lithuania, the 4-year-old child may not be particularly motivated to learn English because they've already noticed they never use it outside of the play school, and so they can just keep using Lithuanian. And so we need to make sure that we're paying attention to our children's messages as well, and we don't expect them to all be super motivated, because they won't all be super motivated. Some will definitely be, but not all. So some top strategies for supporting language development at home. One of the best things that you can do is read books to your children, and to do what we call dialogic reading, which is talking about the book while you're reading it. So if you're reading a little book about Miffy or Nijntje in Dutch, what do you think Miffy's going to do next? Do you think she likes her ice cream? What do you think she should play with? The kinds of questions that get them thinking and then they have to respond to are a really good way to develop speech overall and to develop speech in another language. Reading books is something you can do with your children in other languages. If you're a French-speaking parent, you can read to your child in English. You don't need to worry about your accent. You don't need to worry about not being perfect. It's just a way to engage them in learning another language with a little bit of support from you. You should also read to them in French, but you can be a little bit more flexible if you're sure that they're getting enough input in the majority language. When you play games with your children, think about every game as a possible language acquisition device, if you will. And so if you're playing games with counting, or if you're playing games with taking turns, all of that repetitive language around game playing helps children learn these formulas of can I have, it's my turn, can I roll the dice, or pass me the dice? And so repeating the same kinds of games helps them build more language rather than always having different language coming from different games. Narrate your daily life to your children. You should be doing this in your own language anyway, whether or not your child is bilingual. When our children are very young, they're just processing language. It takes children quite a long time, at least a year, usually, to say their first word. But in that first year, they're processing. And so the more language you give them in that first year, mommy's going to go make a coffee. She's really tired last night. Why do you think mommy's tired? Well, somebody woke her up. All of that narration is just rich language that they're processing. And it's a real boost to their linguistic development. Over time, you will see the benefits as well. And finally, if you are a family that is trying to raise your child as a bilingual or multilingual in languages that aren't as frequently spoken around, you try and find friends. It's really valuable for kids to have the opportunity to play with other children in languages, not only to hear them from their parents. It doesn't have to be someone their own age. One of the most powerful strategies that I've seen families use is to get a teenager to come over and play with their younger children, to play games, because young children love playing with big children. And just somebody else speaking that language who's interesting and fun will give the children a bit of a motivation boost. So these are some things that you could think about in terms of how you support language development at home in your own languages, in the home languages, and eventually, if you want to, in other languages that you are helping your children acquire as well. There is always a necessity to have important conversations with different people when we're raising our children as multilinguals. And the first important conversation that we start when our children are very young and continue for as long as they live with you, I still have them with my children, and one of them doesn't live at home anymore, is conversations about why we've chosen these languages for you. Again, children are not all innately motivated to learn new languages. And if you're not having conversations about why those languages are important to you, to your community, to the grandparents, to whoever it is, they don't necessarily buy in the way we want them to. So our children are a part of the journey. We make the language choices and design the plan, but it's actually our children who do the hard work. And so the conversations we have with them about why are really important and powerful to help them understand where we're going with this, well, why we want it and why it's important. And they can be conversations about the emotional side. So mommy always uses English because it's the language of my heart. You can speak to me in Italian if you want, but I'm going to use English because it's the language of my heart. They can be conversations about practical matters. For example, I work with international students a lot, and there's quite a strong narrative among the German community that they want their children to go home to Germany for university because it's very high quality and it's free. But they need to keep up their German to do that. And so for teenagers, that's an important part of the discussion. Why do we want you to work on these languages? What will it do for you in terms of how will it benefit you? We also need then to have conversations with other people who are either involved in our family language plan or impacted by. So with childcare, school, teachers, family, friends, we need to be clear that our child has languages. We need to be clear that we have a plan, and we need to be clear with different people what their part of that plan is. So that if you're hiring a teenager to come over and play with your child in Italian, that you're very clear, I want you to play with them in Italian. Don't let them know you speak English. When you take your children to childcare, it needs to be clear to their caregivers how many languages they have, what's their dominant language. So we come back to that idea of dominant language. Childcare and school need to know what your child's dominant language is so that they don't get worried if the school language isn't as strong as it needs to be, because you can have that conversation about, their dominant language is strong, so we're not worried about, speech and language delay or anything like that. So I'm going to finish for you with some frequently asked questions. These are the questions that I get asked almost always at the end of live sessions. And the first one is it okay if my child mixes their languages? And the answer is yes. All bilinguals mix their languages in different ways and for different reasons. So every once in a while, I will say something in French because the word is better or I feel like it. Mixing languages actually is a very high-level linguistic skill. And when you listen to your children, you will be in admiration of their skill, because they will take a word in Italian and conjugate it in German, or they'll take a word in French and pronounce it as if it's English. They're using their languages in really skillful ways because they're connected in the brain. They're not stopping to think about, am I using the right code? They're just thinking, this is a word for that, but I have to pronounce it this way. And so mixing itself is not a problem at all. We do need to pay attention to, if I put my child in an environment where everybody only speaks Polish, can they use Polish effectively? Do they need to mix all the time, or do they just like to mix? If a child mixes in an environment where it's not useful to them, i.e. they're speaking to someone who doesn't speak that language, sometimes it's an indication that their vocabulary is lacking in one of their languages, and then we need to do a bit of boosting of input in that language. But overall, language mixing is what bilinguals do, all of us. A lot of parents have been told that they should only use their language all the time. And so if you're the French-speaking parent, you can only use French ever with your child. And it can be quite stressful to feel like that when you live in a multilingual family and you want to talk to different people. So, and the answer is, of course, no, you don't have to only use your language all the time. In fact, those kinds of guidelines are more often for parents than for children. Children can deal with different languages from different people. If they're getting enough in each of those languages, they'll sort it out. Sometimes we discourage parents from using the majority language with their child because we worry about the impact on the minority language. So for example, I spoke French to my children, but I'm also a fluent English speaker. The more English I use with them, the less French I was using with them. So it wasn't that I needed to use French all the time for some linguistic reason, but I needed to use French almost all the time because otherwise they weren't going to learn French properly. And so it's about that balance. Will my child sound like a native speaker? I have to say that very often parents who choose for bilingual preschools, bilingual daycares, and bilingual schools are hoping for this kind of mythical native speaker accent. And the first thing I have to say is, well, whose native speaker accent? If you've put your child into an English-speaking preschool in Armenia, do you want them to sound like me from Canada? Do you want them to sound like somebody from England? What part of England? Do you want them to sound like somebody from the United States? What part of the United States? So this idea of native speaker actually has become very outdated because languages have different accents spoken even by native speakers. And so we need to move away a bit from thinking of somehow a native speaker accent is a quality mark for our languages, because it's not. We just want them to be able to have the languages they need in the context and purposes they need them for. And so some children will end up speaking like native speakers and some will not, but actually it's irrelevant. And finally, can any and every child become bilingual? Is it ever bad for children to become bilingual? The research on this is quite consistent in various areas, that children with a wide variety of cognitive and learning challenges can become bilingual. So children with Down syndrome, children who are on the autism spectrum, children with speech and language delays can all become successfully bilingual. If our child needs languages, they need languages and they will get there. And so there's never a reason to say this child shouldn't become bilingual because they have X, Y, Z. Part of the conversations we sometimes need to have is with professionals, because professionals don't always know that. It's very common for educational psychologists or speech and language therapists to tell parents, your child has a speech delay, you should drop a language. And so it's really important to work with the right professionals if you're worried about your children. But really, overall, we need to remember that across all of these, bilingualism is a journey. It's not a destination. And so our children are going to continue developing their languages into their 20s. We're all working hard to get it right all along the way. And then we're going to push them out of our nests when they're 18, 19, 20, but they've got to take it forward themselves. The more we've inspired them, the more we've helped them develop a love for languages, the more we've helped them develop their skills in languages, the more likely they are to take those languages with them. But again, journey, not a destination. So that wraps up our short talk for today. I've put here on the slide the references that I used in the slide, and also some contact details if you would like to get a hold of me in any of my different websites or contact ways. Thank you very much for your time. It's been very enjoyable for me. I hope it's been enjoyable for you and that you are renewed and excited to continue your journey with your children.